They say every empire has its monsters. But what happens when those monsters are the only thing keeping it alive? In the dying light of the 41st millennium, where trillions pray to a corpse god and hope itself is a luxury few can afford, there exists a chapter of Space Marines so feared that their very name is whispered only in the highest corridors of power. They are not heroes. They are not saviors. They are the Minotaurs, and they are the Imperium's most brutal secret. Picture this: a world in open rebellion, not against Xenos invaders, not against the corrupting tendrils of chaos, against the Imperium itself. Chapter Master Lugd Hurun of the Astral Claws has declared independence, carved out his own empire in the Maelstrom, and dozens of Space Marine chapters have answered his call. It is the Badab War, and it threatens to tear the Imperium apart from within. Loyalist chapters clash with traitors in a conflict that will be remembered for millennia. But as the war grinds on, as both sides bleed and die for their convictions, something else is coming. Something worse than any traitor. The Minotaurs arrive without warning. No one called them. No one requested their aid. They simply appear in the Badab sector like an executioner stepping into a condemned man's cell. And when they fight, it is not with the nobility of the Ultramarines or the righteous fury of the Black Templars. They fight with a cold, methodical brutality that makes even hardened veterans recoil in horror. They do not accept surrender. They do not show mercy. When the Minotaurs finish with a traitor chapter, there is nothing left but corpses and silence. But here's where it gets strange. Here's where the legend becomes something darker. Every Space Marine chapter in the Imperium struggles for resources. They beg, they trade, they negotiate with the Adeptus Mechanicus for a single suit of Terminator armor, for a handful of ancient weapons. Yet the Minotaurs possess war gear that would make even first founding chapters jealous. Entire companies clad in Terminator armor, relics from the dark age of technology, weapons that haven't been manufactured in 10,000 years, gunships and battle tanks in numbers that defy explanation. How does a chapter that supposedly guards the outer reaches of Imperial space possess such wealth? Who is supplying them? The answer, if the whispers are true, leads directly to Terra itself. To the High Lords of Terra, those 12 individuals who rule the Imperium in the Emperor's name. Those masters of humanity who sit in their gilded thrones and move entire sectors like pieces on a game board. They need something that the noble Space Marines cannot provide. They need enforcers without conscience, executioners without question. A blunt instrument to shatter those who grow too powerful, too independent, too dangerous to the established order. They need the Minotaurs. Think about what this means. Space Marines are supposed to be the Emperor's finest, created to protect humanity, to stand as beacons of hope in an uncaring universe. But the Minotaurs? They kill other Space Marines. They hunt their own brothers. During the Badab War, they boarded the Lamenter's flagship while the Lamenters were still fighting as loyalists, still bleeding for the Imperium. The Minotaurs didn't care. They slaughtered their way through the ship, targeting the Lamenter's gene seed stores, destroying the very future of a loyalist chapter. Why? Because the Lamenters had shown up to support Huron before his betrayal was clear. Because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because the Minotaurs had been given a target, and collateral damage is irrelevant to an executioner. But their origins make even less sense than their actions. The Minotaurs claim to be descended from the Ultramarines, that most noble and stable of gene lines. Yet everything about them contradicts this. Their savage close-quarters tactics. Their bronze-skinned warriors with burning red eyes. Their absolute, unquestioning loyalty not to the Emperor's dream, but to the High Lord's commands. Some scholars, those brave or foolish enough to investigate, whisper a different truth. They suggest the Minotaurs carry the gene seed of the Iron Warriors, traitors who turned to chaos 10,000 years ago. That perhaps, in some black site laboratory hidden in the depths of Terra, the High Lords created a chapter from traitor stock because only traitors could do what needed to be done. Imagine being a Space Marine and learning this. Imagine dedicating your life to the Emperor, enduring centuries of war, only to discover that your own leaders have created a chapter specifically to destroy you if you ever step out of line. Every chapter master who grows too influential, every chapter that questions orders, every warrior who dares to think independently. They all have a target on their backs, and the Minotaurs are the ones who pull the trigger. After the Badab War, they disappeared again, vanished into the darkness between stars. But their legacy remained, a warning carved in blood and bone. Then came the Indomitus Crusade, Robert Guilliman's great push to save the Imperium from annihilation. And where did the Minotaurs emerge? Not on the front lines against chaos, not defending innocent worlds. No, they appeared in the Ecclesiarchy's Chalnoth expanse, where they systematically dismantled Space Marine chapters who had grown too close to the Adeptus Ministorum. Chapters who had found faith and purpose. Chapters who might question the Primarch's new order. The Executioner's blade never rests. But here's what keeps Imperial scholars awake at night. What makes even Inquisitors nervous when they think too deeply about the Minotaurs. If the High Lords truly control them, if they truly are nothing more than attack dogs on a leash, then what happens when that leash breaks? What happens when the Minotaurs decide they no longer need masters? They possess the weapons, the resources, and the utter ruthlessness to challenge anyone in the Imperium. They've already proven they can destroy other Space Marines. They've already shown they'll follow orders no matter how dark. But orders require obedience, and obedience requires belief. What does a monster believe in when it's ordered to kill heroes? The Imperium stands on a knife's edge, held together by faith, fear, and violence. Trillions of souls look to the Space Marines as protectors, as angels of death who stand between humanity and extinction. But somewhere in that vast darkness, bronze-armored warriors sharpen their weapons and wait for the next command. They don't ask why. They don't question. They simply kill and kill and kill again. And the question that nobody dares to ask out loud, the question that haunts the halls of Terra itself, is this. When the Imperium finally needs heroes again, when it desperately requires Space Marines who will fight for humanity's soul rather than just its structure, will it find them? Or will it find only the monsters it created, standing over the bodies of everyone who dared to dream of something better? The Minotaurs are watching. Always watching. The first time most Space Marines encounter the Minotaurs, they don't understand what they're seeing. The bronze armor gleaming in the darkness, the bull's head emblazoned on their chest plates, the way they move with a kind of industrial precision, like a manufacturer's grinding gears given flesh and purpose. There's something fundamentally wrong about them, something that sets every instinct screaming. It's not just their brutality. The galaxy is full of brutal warriors. It's the emptiness behind their eyes, the absolute absence of anything resembling doubt. Captain Corian Sumatras of the Red Scorpions learned this the hard way. It was during the Badab War, in the dying days of Huron's rebellion. The Red Scorpions had fought with distinction, their gene seed purity and tactical excellence earning them respect from every loyalist chapter. They had bled for the Imperium, lost brothers to traitor fire, endured months of grinding warfare in the void and unpoisoned worlds. When the war finally turned, when the traitors began to crumble, there was a sense of grim satisfaction. Justice, however delayed, was coming. Then the Minotaurs boarded the Cestus Metallicon. Sumatras watched it happen from his gunship, watched the bronze-armored giants tear through the hull of the ancient star fort that Huron had turned into his final bastion. But they weren't attacking defensive positions. They weren't targeting strategic objectives. They were moving toward the gene seed repositories, toward the chapter serfs' quarters, toward the places where wounded loyalists were being treated. The Vox channels filled with screaming, not from traitors, from the Lamenters, from the Mantis warriors who had turned back to the Emperor's light, from warriors who had fought and bled alongside the Red Scorpions. Sumatras gave the order to intercede. His squad teleported directly into the repository chamber, materializing between the Minotaurs and their targets. For a moment, There was silence. Just two groups of space marines, both loyalists, both servants of the Emperor, staring at each other across a room filled with the genetic future of an entire chapter. Then Sumatras spoke, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of service. "Stand down. These warriors are under our protection." The Minotaur captain didn't even pause. He raised his power axe and charged. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. The Minotaurs fought with a ferocity that defied understanding, targeting weak points in armor with surgical precision, exploiting every microsecond of hesitation, every flicker of mercy. They didn't fight like space marines, who battle with honor and tactical doctrine drilled into their very bones. They fought like assassins, like executioners who had done this 1,000 times before. When it was over, when Sumatras lay bleeding out on the cold deck plating, his entire squad dead around him, the Minotaur captain finally spoke. "The High Lords have given us a mandate. Your protection is irrelevant." Then they continued their work, methodically destroying the gene seed, killing the wounded, erasing entire bloodlines with the casual efficiency of a scribe striking out errors in a ledger. Sumatras survived only because a tech marine dragged his broken body away in the chaos. But he never forgot. He never forgot the emptiness in that captain's voice, the way he spoke of the High Lords, not as distant authorities, but as immediate masters. As if they were standing right there, watching, approving. Years later, Sumatras would investigate, quietly, carefully, using every contact, every favor, every secret passage through the Imperium's labyrinthine bureaucracy. What he discovered should have been impossible. The Minotaurs had been refounded. Not once, but possibly twice. Their current iteration emerged during the Cursed Founding, that dark period where the Adeptus Mechanicus experimented with Space Marine gene seed in ways that violated every sacred protocol. Entire chapters from that founding were mutated, corrupted, or driven mad. Most were destroyed or disappeared into the darkness, but the Minotaurs thrived. They grew stronger, better equipped, more numerous than chapters twice their age. And every time they deployed, it was on the direct orders of the High Lords, targeting not the Imperium's external enemies, but its internal threats. The pattern was undeniable. When the Celestial Lions began asking uncomfortable questions about inquisitorial overreach on Armageddon, they were ambushed by orcs with suspiciously accurate intelligence. Nearly their entire chapter was annihilated. The few survivors reported seeing bronze armor in the shadows, heard whispers of Minotaur kill teams coordinating with Imperial forces to ensure no reinforcements arrived in time. When the Marines errant grew too independent, too focused on their own crusades rather than High Lord's priorities, the Minotaurs challenged them to an honor duel over contested recruitment rights. The duel was supposed to be ceremonial, limited. Instead, the Minotaurs butchered the Marines' errant's command structure and claimed their best worlds, leaving the chapter permanently crippled. But Sumatras found something else in his investigations, something that made his blood run cold. Requisition orders. Thousands of them, spanning decades, all authorized by someone within the High Lord's inner circle. Orders for Tartaros pattern Terminator armor, for Land Raider Achilles variants, for weapons from sealed forges on Mars that supposedly no longer function. The Minotaurs received equipment that first founding chapters had been denied for centuries. They had access to resources that even the Ultramarines couldn't requisition without years of negotiation. Someone was building an army, not to fight chaos, not to combat the Xenos, to fight other Space Marines. The implications spread like poison through Sumatras's mind. How many chapters had been destroyed not because they turned traitor, but because they became inconvenient? How many heroes had died not to traitors' blades, but to the executioner's axe? The Imperium preached unity, brotherhood, shared sacrifice in the face of extinction. But beneath that noble veneer lurked something far darker. A cold calculus that viewed even the Emperor's finest warriors as expendable pieces, to be eliminated the moment they threatened the existing power structure. And the worst part? It was working. The Minotaurs had become the Imperium's open secret. Every chapter master knew about them. Every warrior who rose high enough in his chapter's hierarchy learned the truth. There existed a chapter that killed other Space Marines on command, and absolutely nothing could be done about it. To resist was to confirm yourself as a threat. To investigate was to mark yourself for elimination. To even speak openly about them was to invite their attention. The Minotaurs weren't just enforcers. They were a psychological weapon, a constant reminder that no matter how powerful you became, no matter how many worlds you saved or enemies you destroyed, you existed only at the pleasure of distant masters who viewed you as little more than a useful tool. But here's what the High Lords might not have calculated. Here's the variable that even their most sophisticated predictions might have missed. Space Marines remember. Every chapter maintains libraries, archives, oral histories, passed from generation to generation. They remember their fallen brothers. They remember the injustices, the betrayals, the moments when the Imperium they serve failed to live up to its own ideals. And they remember the Minotaurs. Every broken treaty, every dishonorable kill, every time the bronze-armored killers appeared and destroyed something precious. These memories accumulate like sediment at the bottom of an ocean, layer upon layer, century upon century, waiting for the right current to stir them up. When Reboot Guilliman returned, when the Primarch himself walked once more among his sons, something shifted in the Imperium's careful balance. Here was a demigod, the Emperor's own blood, who looked at the Imperium and saw not glory but decay, who spoke of reform, of returning to the Emperor's true vision, of sweeping away 10,000 years of accumulated corruption and stagnation. The Space Marines, so long divided and isolated, suddenly had a champion who might actually listen. And in the shadows, the Minotaurs watched, still following orders, still sharpening their axes. But now their targets were different. Now they moved against chapters who supported the ecclesiarchy too strongly, who might resist Guilliman's secular reformation. Now they acted to eliminate warriors who questioned the Primarch's authority, who suggested that perhaps 10,000 years of tradition shouldn't be cast aside so easily. The executioners had found new necks to place on the chopping block. But something was happening. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable to those who knew where to look. The Minotaurs were changing, not in their tactics, not in their brutality, but in their certainty. For the first time in their existence, they were receiving conflicting orders. The High Lords wanted one thing, the Primarch wanted another. And caught between these two authorities, the Minotaurs had to make a choice that they had never been designed to make. They had to decide who they truly served. In a fortress monastery on the edge of the Segmentum Solar, Chapter Master Asterion Malak stood before his assembled captains. The chamber was stark, unadorned except for the bronze bull symbols that covered every surface. No relics decorated these walls, no honored names of fallen heroes. Just the symbol, repeated endlessly, a reminder of what they were, what they had always been. Malak looked at his warriors, these brothers he had led for decades, who had never questioned, never hesitated, never faltered in their duty. And for the first time in his long blood-soaked existence, he spoke words that felt like treason. The Imperium is fracturing. The orders we receive contradict each other. The masters we serve are at war with themselves. He paused, his ancient eyes reflecting something that might have been doubt. We were created to be weapons, perfect, unquestioning. But what does a weapon do when its wielders fight over who gets to pull the trigger? The silence that followed was absolute, because every warrior in that room knew the answer. They had always known it, buried deep beneath layers of conditioning and duty. A weapon without a master doesn't cease to be dangerous. It becomes something far worse. It becomes free. Freedom, as it turns out, is the most dangerous thing you can give to something built only to kill. 3 months after Malak's words echoed through that empty chamber, the Minotaurs did something unprecedented. They ignored an order, not openly, not with declarations or manifestos. They simply didn't arrive when summoned. The High Lords called for them to deploy to the Helican subsector, where the Marines' malevolent had grown dangerously independent, their disregard for civilian casualties finally crossing a line even the Administratum couldn't ignore. The order was clear. The target was designated. The Minotaurs were to make an example. They never showed up. Instead, they were reported 3 sectors away, engaged in what they claimed was a critical operation against an emerging Orc Wung. By the time anyone realized the discrepancy, the Orcs were defeated, the Minotaurs had vanished, and the Marines' malevolent remained untouched, continuing their brutal campaigns with impunity. It was a small thing. A single missed deployment in a galaxy where thousands of operations occur simultaneously. But to those who understood what the Minotaurs represented, it was an earthquake. The executioner had hesitated. Lord Militant Trevelyan of the High Lord's Chamber understood immediately. He'd been the one feeding the Minotaurs for decades, authorizing their requisitions, ensuring their supply lines remained unquestioned and unquestionable. He'd shaped them into the perfect instrument of control, or so he believed. Now standing in his private sanctum deep within the Senatorum Imperialis, surrounded by data slates and strategic projections, he felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries of political maneuvering. Fear. Not fear of the Minotaurs themselves. He'd seen their brutality up close, witnessed the aftermath of their operations. No, this was something colder, more existential. It was the fear of realizing that the machine you'd built so carefully, calibrated so precisely, had just developed a mind of its own. And worse, you couldn't simply shut it down. The Minotaurs possessed enough firepower to level Hive cities, enough tactical genius to outsmart any conventional force sent against them, and enough resources to sustain themselves indefinitely. They were self-sufficient by design. He'd made sure of that, ensured they'd never need to beg or negotiate for supplies like lesser chapters. It had seemed like brilliance at the time, a way to keep them loyal and effective. Now it felt like the worst mistake of his immortally extended life. Trevelyan accessed the deepest archives, files sealed under layers of encryption that would trigger fatal countermeasures if breached incorrectly. He needed to understand what he was dealing with, needed to trace the Minotaurs back to their source. The official records were sanitized, of course. A refounding during the cursed 21st founding. Gene seed of uncertain origin. First recorded engagement 3 centuries ago. Nothing that explained their strange nature, their unnatural effectiveness. But there were other records, older ones. Files that predated the Minotaur's official recognition by millennia. What he found made his blood run cold. The Minotaurs weren't created during the cursed founding. They were repurposed. Somewhere in the dark years of M32, during the age of apostasy when the Imperium nearly tore itself apart, a failed chapter called the Brazen Bulls had been destroyed. Not for heresy, not for mutation, for refusing to execute their orders. They'd been sent to massacre a world that had sheltered refugees from a neighboring sector, refugees fleeing an inquisitorial purge. The Brazen Bulls had investigated, found the refugees innocent of any taint, and refused. For that mercy, that single moment of independent judgment, they were declared excommunicate traitorous and hunted to extinction. Almost to extinction. Someone had preserved their gene seed, studied it, modified it in ways that violated every prohibition against genetic tampering. Then, during the cursed founding, when such experiments were tacitly permitted in the desperate hope of creating better warriors, they brought them back. Stripped of identity, rebuilt from genetic material up, indoctrinated with absolute obedience. The Brazen Bulls, who had died for showing mercy, were resurrected as the Minotaurs, who knew only how to kill. But here's what the ancient files revealed. What made Trevelyan's hands tremble as he read. Gene memory. The apothecaries who'd reconstructed the chapter had discovered traces of genetic memory embedded in the recovered gene seed. Memories of their extinction, of being destroyed for choosing conscience over orders. They'd tried to erase it, burned out whole sections of the progenoid glands, subjected the first generation to psychoconditioning so severe that 3/4 of them died in the process. They'd done everything possible to ensure the new chapter would never, ever refuse an order again. They'd failed, not completely, not obviously, but the memory was there, buried so deep that it might take centuries to surface, like a splinter working its way up through layers of scar tissue. And now, after hundreds of years of blind obedience, of being the Imperium's perfect monsters, that splinter was beginning to emerge. The Minotaurs were starting to remember what they'd been. And more terrifying still, they were beginning to question what they'd become. On the world of Nemeton Tertius, a death world used for training exercises and live-fire drills, a young Minotaur sergeant named Hesiod crouched in the ruins of an ancient temple. His squad had been hunting a group of feral humans, descendants of colonists who'd regressed to barbarism after being abandoned during the Age of Strife. It was supposed to be target practice, a way to keep their skills sharp between deployments. Clean, simple, efficient. But Hesiod had found something in the temple. Carvings, impossibly old, worn almost smooth by millennia of wind and rain, but still visible if you knew how to look. And Space Marines always knew how to look. The carvings showed warriors in power armor, but the symbol on their breastplates wasn't the Minotaur bull. It was something else, something that made his enhanced mind itch with almost recognition. A shield, a charging bull. And beneath it, words in High Gothic so ancient that even his linguistic training struggled to parse them. We chose mercy. Let them remember we chose mercy. Hesiod stared at those words for a long time, his genetically enhanced brain processing information at speeds that would kill an unaugmented human. Something was wrong. The words resonated in a way that pure information shouldn't. They felt familiar, like remembering a dream upon waking, where the emotional weight remains even as the details fade. He reached out, traced the carving with his gaunted finger, and in that moment, something cracked in his mind. A flash, just a fragment, but undeniable. He saw himself standing in different armor, bronze still but marked with different symbols. Saw himself holding a bolter to a child's head, a refugee child, innocent and terrified. Saw his finger on the trigger, and then saw himself lower the weapon. Heard his own voice saying words he'd never spoken in this life. No, I won't. Court-martial me. Execute me. But I won't kill children for your political convenience. Then fire. Pain. His entire world burning as fleet bombardment turned the sky to flame. As his brothers did, screaming around him, as he realized too late that mercy had been their death sentence. Hesiod jerked back from the carving, his breathing ragged inside his helmet. It wasn't possible. Genetic memory was a myth, a superstition that even Space Marines dismissed as pre-imperial ignorance. What you inherited from your gene seed was physical, not experiential. You didn't remember your gene father's life. You couldn't, but the memory remained sharp and clear and undeniable. And with it came a question that burned hotter than any plasma weapon. If they'd killed us once for choosing mercy, what would they do if we chose it again? The question spread, not through official channels. The Minotaurs didn't communicate doubts through proper chain of command because they'd never had doubts to communicate before. Instead, it moved like a virus, whispered in training cages and meditation cells, shared during the quiet moments between combat drops when warriors had nothing to do but think. More and more of them were experiencing the flashes, the fragments of impossible memory, a last stand against loyalist forces. A desperate message sent to Terra, begging someone to investigate their accusations before passing judgment. The cold certainty that they were dying for doing the right thing. Chapter Master Malak knew. Of course he knew. He'd experienced the memories first, years ago, kept them buried under layers of duty and doctrine. But he'd always known they were there, waiting. And now they were emerging in his brothers, in warriors who'd only ever known obedience, who'd been shaped into perfect killers without conscience or doubt. They were waking up, remembering, becoming something they'd never been designed to be. They were becoming Space Marines again. Real ones, the kind who made choices. In the Senatorum Imperialis, Trevelyan made his decision. The Minotaurs had become unstable. Their effectiveness was compromised. And most dangerous of all, they knew too much about the High Lord's operations, had carried out too many missions that could never be publicly acknowledged. If they went rogue, if they started talking, if they decided to reveal what they'd done and who had ordered them to do it, the political fallout would be catastrophic. Entire power structures would collapse. Wars would erupt between chapters seeking vengeance for fallen brothers. The careful balance that kept the Imperium functioning would shatter. There was only one solution. The Minotaurs had to be destroyed. All of them. Every warrior, every piece of evidence, every record of their existence. It would be expensive, difficult, and dangerous. But it was necessary. Trevelyan began drafting the orders, reaching out to loyal chapters, to inquisitors who owed him favors, to Imperial Guard regiments that wouldn't ask questions. He would need an overwhelming force, a coordinated strike that would hit the Minotaurs before they realized what was happening. He would need to ensure absolute information security, make certain that no warning reached them before the noose tightened. He would need to become exactly the kind of threat that the Minotaurs had been created to eliminate. The irony wasn't lost on him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wondered if this was how it had felt for those ancient High Lords who'd ordered the Brazen Bulls destroyed. If they'd experienced this same cold certainty that there was no other choice, that mercy would be weakness, that the greater good demanded sacrifice. If they'd told themselves the same lies. But Trevelyan pushed that voice down, buried it under centuries of political survival instinct. He'd built his power by making hard choices, by never allowing sentiment to interfere with necessity. The Minotaurs were a problem. Problems had solutions. Emotion was irrelevant. He transmitted the orders. And on Nemeton Tertius, in that ancient temple with its weathered carvings, he had felt something shift in the air. A change in the immaterium, perhaps, or just a warrior's instinct honed by centuries of combat. Something was coming. Something that would force every Minotaur to make a choice they'd never been designed to make. Fight for the Imperium that had created them. Or fight for the brothers they'd become. The answer, whatever it was, would be written in blood. The storm broke 3 weeks later in a way that no one could have predicted. The Minotaurs' fortress monastery, the Labyrinth, hung in the void above a dead world called Varsavia. It wasn't a traditional monastery, not the kind of soaring cathedral fortress that most chapters called home. It was a mobile battle station, a converted mass conveyor retrofitted with weapons batteries and armor plating thick enough to withstand sustained bombardment. Utilitarian, efficient, perfect for a chapter that had no homeworld, no recruiting worlds, no roots anywhere in the Imperium except in the orders they received and the blood they spilled. Malak stood on the command deck, watching the auger displays flicker with incoming data. His captains surrounded him, their bronze armor casting strange shadows in the red emergency lighting. They'd been expecting this. Not the exact timing, not the precise composition of the fleet now translating into real space around them, but the inevitability of it. You didn't ignore the High Lords without consequences. You didn't start questioning orders without someone noticing. The fleet was massive. 6 chapters worth of space marines. The Crimson Fists still rebuilding from their near extinction, but eager to prove their renewed strength. The Exorcists, gray-armored demon hunters who viewed any deviation from orthodoxy as potential corruption. The Red Hunters, another chapter with suspiciously close ties to the Inquisition. And backing them up, 3 full battle groups of the Imperial Navy, dozens of cruisers and destroyers and system monitors, enough firepower to crack a planet's crust. But it was the 4th chapter that made Malak's jaw tighten, the Marines Errant. The same chapter the Minotaurs had crippled years ago in that supposed honor duel. They'd come for revenge, and this time they had the Imperium's full blessing to take it. "They're hailing us," reported the communications officer, a chapter serf who'd served the Minotaurs for 40 years without ever seeing them show hesitation. Until now. The Crimson Fist's chapter master. He's offering terms. Put it through, Malak said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling through every warrior on the deck. The hololith flickered to life, and Pedro Cantor's scarred face materialized above the projection table. The Crimson Fist's chapter master looked tired, worn down by decades of desperate warfare, but his eyes held an iron resolve. When he spoke, there was no anger in his voice, just a kind of sad certainty. "Chapter Master Malak, I'm told you're expecting us. That's good. It means you understand what this is." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The High Lords have declared you excommunicate traitorous. All Minotaurs' assets are to be seized, all gene seed destroyed, all warriors executed. You have 1 hour to power down your weapons and prepare for boarding. Resist, and we will show no mercy." Malak stared at the hololith for a long moment. Around him, his captains shifted, hands drifting toward weapons, bodies tensing for combat. They'd fought together for so long that they moved like parts of a single organism, each warrior instinctively understanding the other's intentions. And right now, every intention was screaming the same thing: fight. But Malak held up a hand for stalling them. He looked at Cantor's image, at the weariness behind those eyes, and he understood something fundamental. Cantor didn't want this. None of them wanted this. But they were doing it anyway, because that's what Space Marines did. They followed orders. They served the Imperium. Even when those orders turned brother against brother, even when the Imperium they served had become something unrecognizable. "Tell me something, Lord Cantor," Malak said quietly. "Do you know why we're being destroyed? Our actual crime?" Cantor's expression didn't change. "You ignored a direct order from the High Lords. You've been acting independently. There are concerns about your loyalty. We've never been disloyal to the Emperor. Not once, not ever." Malak's voice carried a weight that made even his own warriors pause. "But we did something unforgivable. We started asking questions. We started wondering if maybe, just maybe, the High Lords weren't infallible. If maybe some of the orders we'd been given over the centuries were less about protecting humanity and more about protecting power." "That's not your place to question," Cantor replied, but there was something in his tone. A crack, a moment of uncertainty. "No, it's not. We were built to obey. Shaped for it. Conditioned for it. Every thought that wasn't about obedience was burned out of us before we even drew our first breath as Space Marines." Malak leaned forward, his massive frame seeming to fill the hololith's field of view. "But we remember, Cantor. We remember what happens to chapters who think for themselves. We remember because it happened to us before, in another life, when we had another name. And we remember because the High Lords made sure we'd never forget, even if they tried to bury that memory so deep we'd never find it." The command deck had gone silent. Every Minotaur present was listening, and Malak knew that every warrior on Cantor's fleet was listening too, because this was being broadcast across all channels. This was the moment. The one chance to speak truth before the violence began. "The Brazen Bulls," Malak continued, "that was us. Or the chapter we were built from. They were destroyed for refusing to massacre refugees, for showing mercy when ordered to show none. And when they died, someone collected their gene seed and rebuilt them, rebuilt us. Made us into something that would never refuse again. Made us into the Minotaurs. We've spent centuries being the Imperium's executioners, killing our own brothers, destroying chapters who'd committed no crime except inconveniencing the wrong people. We did it without question, without hesitation, because we were weapons, and weapons don't have consciences." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with an emotion that Minotaurs weren't supposed to feel. "Until we started remembering. Until we realized that every order we followed, every brother we killed, every chapter we helped destroy, we were becoming exactly the kind of threat we'd been created to eliminate. We were the corruption. We were the ones betraying everything the Emperor stood for, not through rebellion, not through heresy, but through blind, unthinking obedience to masters who'd stopped caring about humanity centuries ago." Cantor's face had gone pale. You can't possibly believe that justifies. It doesn't justify anything, Malak cut him off. We've done terrible things, unforgivable things, we know that. But here's what you need to understand, Cantor. Here's what every chapter master listening needs to hear. They will do this to you too. The moment you become inconvenient, the moment you ask the wrong questions, or show too much independence, or just survive long enough to accumulate too much power, they'll find a reason. They'll manufacture evidence. And they'll send someone to destroy you, just like they sent us to destroy so many others. Just like they're sending you to destroy us now. The silence that followed was absolute. Malak could see Cantor struggling with it, see the doubt creeping into his expression, because every chapter master knew it was true. They all lived with that knowledge, that fear. The Imperium you served could turn on you in a heartbeat, and there would be nothing you could do about it except die well. We won't surrender, Malak said finally. Not because we think we can win. We can't. You have us outgunned and outnumbered. But if we surrender, if we just accept execution, then we're validating everything they've done to us. We're saying it was right to turn us into monsters. We're saying it's acceptable for the High Lords to have a secret army that murders other Space Marines on demand. So we're going to fight. We're going to make you kill us. And we're going to make damn sure that everyone knows why. He reached for the hololith controls, but before he could sever the connection, Cantor spoke again. What would you have us do, Malak? Turn our guns on Terra? Start a civil war? The Imperium is already falling apart. The Great Rift has cut us in half. Chaos is everywhere. The Xenos are pushing into Imperial space on a dozen fronts. This isn't the time for insurrection. No, Malak agreed, it's not. But it's also not the time to keep killing each other for the entertainment of politicians. Somewhere between blind obedience and open rebellion, there has to be another path. We just need someone brave enough to find it. He cut the connection. The command deck erupted into controlled chaos. Captains moving to their positions, battle stations being called, shields powering up. They had an hour, maybe less. Then the storm would hit in full, and the labyrinth would become a tomb for every Minotaur aboard. But as Malak watched his warriors prepare, he felt something unexpected. Not peace, not acceptance, but a strange kind of relief. They were going to die as Space Marines. Not as executioners, not as the High Lord's attack dogs, but as warriors who'd made a choice, who'd drawn a line and refused to cross back. It wouldn't change anything. The Imperium would grind on, crushing anyone who stepped out of line. But maybe, just maybe, someone would remember. Someone would ask questions. Someone would wonder if there was a better way. On the Crimson Fist's flagship, Cantor stood motionless, staring at the empty hololith. His command crew waited for orders for the decisive action that would end this quickly. But he couldn't speak, couldn't move, because everything Malak had said was true, and they all knew it. Captain Alessio Cortez stepped forward, his face grim. "My lord, we have our orders. The Minotaurs are traitors. We end this now, before they can spread their poison any further." "Are they traitors?" Cantor asked quietly. "Or are they just the first ones honest enough to admit what we're all thinking?" The bridge went deathly silent. Cortez opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Lord Cantor, you can't possibly be suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything," Cantor said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm just wondering, that's all. Just wondering." In the void between the two forces, space itself seemed to hold its breath. Weapons were armed. Targeting solutions calculated. Shields hummed at full power. Two groups of humanity's finest warriors, both loyal to the Emperor, both willing to die for the Imperium, preparing to slaughter each other. And for what? Because orders had been given. Because questions had been asked. Because somewhere on Terra, behind gilded doors and ancient walls, someone had decided that loyalty meant never asking why. The hour ticked down. 50 minutes, 40, 30, and then something impossible happened. A new ship translated into the system, emerging from the warp with a flash of impossible light. It was massive, ancient beyond measure, its hull bearing markings that made every space marine present stop and stare in shock, not because they didn't recognize them, but because they did, and what they represented shouldn't have been possible. It was a vessel of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own guardians, the golden warriors who never left Terra except in the direst of circumstances. And it was transmitting on all frequencies, its message cutting through every other communication with the weight of absolute authority. All forces stand down. By order of the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes and the express command of Lord Guilliman, there will be no engagement. The Minotaurs are under investigation, not execution, and the High Lords responsible for issuing illegal execution orders are hereby summoned to Terra to explain themselves before the Primarch. The storm didn't break. It stopped. Frozen in mid-strike, violence suspended by something greater than orders or duty or fear. And in that suspended moment, every warrior present understood that something fundamental had just changed. The old rules, the old certainties, the old terror of speaking truth to power, all of it had just been shattered by the simple fact that someone higher up the chain had said no. The executioners had been called off. The question now was, what would replace them? The custodian's name was Valores, Tribune Valores, though even that title seemed insufficient for what stood before them. He materialized aboard the Labyrinth through a teleportarium strike that bypassed every shield and defense system as if they were nothing more than suggestions. 300 Minotaurs leveled their weapons at him. Bronze giants, gene-forged killers, warriors who'd never backed down from any fight. And they all hesitated, because this wasn't just another space marine. This was something from the Emperor's own hand, a being crafted with arts lost to time, wearing armor that had walked Terra's palace for 10,000 years. His guardian spear hummed with power that made the air itself taste of ozone and ancient fear. Malak descended from the command throne, his captains parting before him like a bronze sea. He stopped 3 meters from the custodian, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to maintain dignity. Neither warrior bowed. Neither needed to. They simply stood, 2 products of the Emperor's vision, separated by millennia and purpose, but bound by something deeper than either could name. "You've caused quite the disturbance," Valores said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in ways human speech never could. "The High Lords are in chaos. Half of them are calling for your immediate execution. The other half are busy destroying evidence of their involvement with your chapter. It would be amusing if it weren't so pathetic." "And the Primarch?" Malak asked. "What does Lord Guilliman say?" "The Primarch says that 10,000 years of secrets have rotted the Imperium from within. That every time he lifts a stone, he finds corruption and conspiracy underneath. That he's tired of discovering new ways his father's dream has been perverted." Valores tilted his head slightly. "But he also says that he doesn't know what to do with you. The Minotaurs are proof of everything wrong with the current system. But you're also a functioning chapter, experienced warriors, desperately needed in this age of endless war. Executing you would be wasteful. Forgiving you would be dangerous. So he sent me to find a third option." "There isn't one," Malak said flatly. "We are what we are, weapons built to kill other space marines. You can't reform us. You can't redeem us. The blood on our hands doesn't wash off just because we started feeling guilty about it." "No," Valores agreed. "It doesn't, but guilt is interesting. Weapons don't feel guilt. Machines don't question their purpose. The fact that you're standing here, that you refused an order, that you're willing to die rather than continue as you were, that suggests you've become something more than what you were designed to be." He began to walk, slowly circling the command deck, his spear tapping against the deck, plating with each step. Every Minotaur tracked him, but none moved to intercept. "You didn't threaten a custodian. Not because you couldn't, because trying would reveal just how vast the gulf was between what you were and what they were. I've read your history," Valores continued, "all of it. The sanitized versions the High Lords keep in their archives. The sealed files they thought were destroyed. Even the fragments recovered from your gene seed's memory imprints. The brazen bulls. Do you know what their last transmission to Terra said? Before the bombardment? Before they were burned from history? Malak said nothing. But something in his posture shifted, tensed. They said, "We will not kill in the Emperor's name what the Emperor would not kill himself. We will not become the monsters our enemies claim we are. If this is treason, then we die as traitors. But we die as men." 23 words. That's all it took to sign their death warrant. The custodian stopped, turning to face Malak directly. The Emperor made many weapons. Some were obvious crude things. Guns and tanks and bombs. But his finest weapons were subtle. He made warriors who could think, who could adapt, who could make decisions in the chaos of war. Because weapons that can't think are just tools. Weapons that can think are soldiers. And soldiers, Chapter Master, are defined not by their ability to kill, but by their ability to choose what's worth killing for. "We've made terrible choices," Malak said, his voice rough. "Destroyed chapters who didn't deserve destruction. Killed brothers who were only guilty of asking questions. We did it because we were ordered to. That's not a choice. That's obedience. But you stopped. That was a choice. Too late. Centuries too late." "Yes," Valores agreed simply. "It was. You can't undo what you've done. You can't bring back the dead or restore the destroyed. The Marines errant will never recover their former strength. The Lamenters lost genetic material that would have saved them from their slow extinction. The Celestial Lions were decimated with your tacit assistance. These are facts. They exist. They will exist forever." He paused, and when he spoke again, something shifted in his tone. Something almost gentle. "But here's what else is a fact. The Imperium is dying. Not in a year or a decade or even a century, but dying nonetheless. The Emperor sits on his throne, holding reality together through nothing but will and the sacrifice of 10,000 souls every day. The Great Rift has split his domain in two. Chaos pours through 1,000,000 cracks in the facade. The Xenos scent weakness and circle like predators. And in this catastrophe, the High Lords spend their energy maintaining their own power, using Space Marines as game pieces, treating humanity's finest defenders as disposable assets in their political scheming." Valores gestured broadly, encompassing not just the labyrinth but everything beyond. "You were their weapon. But weapons can be reforged, purposes can change. The question isn't whether you deserve redemption. You don't. None of us do. The Emperor created us to kill, and we've killed so much that the galaxy is painted in blood older than some civilizations. The question is whether you can be useful. Whether the warrior underneath the executioner can still fight for something beyond orders." "The Primarch wants to use us," Malak said. "Not a question. A statement. The Primarch wants to rebuild the Imperium, properly, the way it should have been 10,000 years ago. But he can't do it with warriors who've learned to thrive in the current system, who've made peace with the corruption and the compromises. He needs warriors who understand how broken everything is, who've seen the rot from the inside, who've been the rot and decided they wanted to be something else." Malak laughed. It was a harsh sound without humor. "So we go from being executioners for the High Lords to being reformers for the Primarch. Just another master. Just another leash." "No," Valores said, and his voice carried absolute certainty. "The Primarch doesn't want your obedience. He has 1,000,000 warriors who obey. What he wants is your judgment. He wants Space Marines who will tell him when an order is wrong, who will push back, who will question. Because blind obedience is what created this mess in the first place. Blind obedience is what turned you into monsters. And blind obedience is what nearly destroyed you when you finally woke up." The custodian moved closer until he stood directly before Malak, golden armor gleaming in the red emergency lighting. "You asked if there was another path. Between blind obedience and open rebellion, this is it. Serve the Imperium. Serve humanity. But never again serve without thought. Never again follow orders that violate what you know to be right. And if that means standing against the High Lords, against the Inquisition, against anyone who treats Space Marines as disposable tools, then you stand. And you trust that the Primarch at least will understand. Silence filled the command deck. Outside, the fleet still waited, weapons charged, hundreds of Space Marines holding their breath. Inside, every Minotaur processed what they'd heard. It was impossible, insane. Everything they'd been taught, everything they'd been conditioned to believe, said that this was just another trap, another manipulation, another way to use them until they were no longer convenient and then discard them. But it was also hope. And hope, for warriors who'd lived without it for so long, was more dangerous than any weapon. Hesiod stepped forward from the ranks, young by Space Marine standards, barely a century of service, the one who'd found the temple, who'd touched the carvings and remembered. He shouldn't have spoken. Protocol demanded silence from anyone below captain, but he spoke anyway. What happens to the High Lords? The ones who used us? Valores turned, regarding the young sergeant with something that might have been approval. Some will fall. Some will face trial. Some will simply disappear into the bureaucracy and hope everyone forgets. The Imperium is too vast to purge completely. Too many people have their hands dirty. Too much depends on compromises with compromised individuals. But the worst of them, the ones who treated you as personal assassins, they will answer to the Primarch. That much I can promise. And the chapters we destroyed, what justice do they get? None, Valores said simply. The dead don't get justice. They get remembered. You can't bring them back. You can't undo what was done. All you can do is make sure it doesn't happen again. Make sure the next generation of High Lords understands that Space Marines aren't tools, that orders have to be justified. That power comes with accountability. He looked back at Malak. The Primarch is offering you a chance, not forgiveness, not absolution. Just a chance to be something other than executioners. To fight for the Imperium that should exist rather than the one that does. To be the warriors the Emperor actually wanted rather than the weapons the High Lords created. Malak stood silent for a long moment. Around him, his brothers waited. Some wanted to accept. Some wanted to refuse. Some were simply too damaged by what they'd done to know what they wanted anymore. But they were all waiting for him to decide. Because that's what a chapter master did. He made the choice that no one else could make. What happened to the Brazen Bull's last message? Malak asked quietly. After they transmitted it. After they died. What happened to those 23 words? Valores smiled, and it was a terrible thing, full of old grief and older anger. Someone archived them. Sealed them away in the deepest vaults on Terra. Marked them classified under authority that would last forever. They were afraid, you see. Afraid that if anyone heard those words, if anyone understood that Space Marines had chosen death over dishonor, it might give others ideas, might make them question, might make them think. So they buried the message along with the chapter. Tried to make sure both would stay dead. He paused, golden eyes gleaming. But the Primarch unsealed the vaults. He's reading everything, every dark secret, every buried crime, every truth that scared the High Lords enough to hide it. And when he read that message, when he understood what your predecessors died for, he said something that I think you need to hear. Malak waited. He said, they were right. 2 words. That's all it took. Malak felt something break inside him. Or maybe something finally heal. He thought of all the brothers he'd killed. All the chapters he'd helped destroy. All the centuries of being a weapon without thought or conscience. And he thought of the Brazen Bulls, dying for choosing mercy. Dying for being what Space Marines were supposed to be. Dying because the Imperium couldn't tolerate warriors who thought for themselves. And he realized that he had a choice. He could die here, making a stand that would change nothing. Could fight the fleet outside until the last Minotaur fell. Could go down in history as another failed chapter. Another cautionary tale about the price of questioning authority. Or he could do something harder. Something that wouldn't feel like redemption, because redemption wasn't possible. But might, just might, be worth doing anyway. He could try. He could take the Primarch's offer. He could spend whatever time remained attempting to be what the Brazen Bulls had been. Not perfect, not clean, but honest. Willing to question, willing to refuse, willing to choose. Melloc looked at his captains, saw the same struggle in their eyes. The same desperate want to believe that there was a path forward that didn't end in more blood and more lies. "We accept," he said finally. "Not because we trust the Primarch, not because we believe we can ever make up for what we've done, but because the alternative is becoming exactly what killed us the first time. And I'd rather die trying to be something better than live as what we were." Valores nodded slowly. "Then you have your answer. And the Imperium has its reformers. The Emperor knows we need them." He turned to leave, the teleportarium already building its charge. But at the last moment, he paused. "One more thing, Chapter Master. The Primarch said to tell you this." He said, "I've made many mistakes in my long life. But my greatest mistake was assuming that loyalty and obedience were the same thing. Don't make that mistake again. Any of you." Then he was gone, light and thunder, leaving only the scent of ozone and the weight of impossible choices. The fleet dispersed slowly, like storm clouds breaking apart after the thunder has passed. The Crimson Fists were the last to leave, Cantor's ship lingering in the void, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Before they translated out, he sent one final message to the labyrinth. No words, just coordinates. A system on the edge of Imperial space where the Marines errant maintained a small outpost. Not a threat. Not a summons, just information. An invitation, perhaps, to begin a conversation that was centuries overdue. Melloc stood at the observation deck, watching the warp rifts swallow ship after ship until only stars remained. His reflection stared back at him from the armored glass, bronze and battered. A warrior who'd lived too long and seen too much. Behind him, the command deck had returned to normal operations, serfs moving with practiced efficiency, servitors maintaining systems that would keep the labyrinth alive for another day, another year, another century, perhaps. Everything looked the same as it had an hour ago, but nothing was the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. Hesiod approached quietly, his footsteps barely audible despite the weight of his armor. The young sergeant had been the first to remember, the first to question, the first to speak when speaking meant risking everything. Melloc wondered if that made him brave or foolish. Probably both. The best warriors usually were. What happens now? Hesiod asked, staring out at the stars. "Now we do the work," Melloc replied. "The boring, difficult, unglamorous work of trying to be better than we were. We accept missions from the Primarch. We question orders that seem wrong. We try to rebuild trust with chapters that have every reason to hate us. And we probably fail, repeatedly, because changing what you are is harder than dying. Death is easy. Death is quick. Change takes time, takes effort. Takes waking up every day and choosing to be something you weren't designed to be. The other chapters won't accept us. We've killed too many of their brothers. The Lamenters lost nearly their entire command structure because of us. The Marines errant are a shadow of what they were. Even the ones we never directly harmed know what we are. What we did." Hesiod's voice carried a weight that shouldn't have existed in someone so young. "How do we live with that?" "We don't," Melloc said simply. "Not comfortably. Not peacefully. We live with it the way you live with any wound that won't heal. You acknowledge it. You carry it. You let it remind you of what happens when you stop thinking, stop questioning, stop being anything more than a weapon in someone else's hand. And maybe, if we're very lucky and work very hard, someday we'll do something that makes one of those broken chapters look at us and think, perhaps they've changed. Perhaps monsters can become warriors again." He turned from the window, facing his sergeant directly. "But here's what you need to understand, Hesiod. We will never be forgiven. Not really, not completely. we don't deserve to be. The brothers we killed, the gene seed we destroyed, the futures we erased, those losses are permanent. They exist in the universe like stars that burned out centuries ago, but whose light still reaches us. We can't change the past. We can only refuse to repeat it. Then what's the point? The question came out raw, desperate. If we can't make up for what we did, if we'll always be the executioners no matter how hard we try to be something else, then what's the point of trying? Maylock was quiet for a long moment, considering. In the distance, he could hear the labyrinth's systems humming, could feel the gentle vibration of the plasma reactors that kept them alive in the void. Life continuing. Purpose persisting. Even when everything felt meaningless, the machinery ground on, because stopping would mean death, and death was too easy an escape. The point, he said finally, is that there are young space marines being created right now, this moment, in fortress monasteries across the Imperium. They're being taken from their families, transformed into weapons, told that their only purpose is to serve and die, and most of them will. They'll serve the Imperium faithfully, kill its enemies without question, and eventually fall in battle having never once wondered if there was another way. But some of them, a few, will start asking questions. They'll wonder why they're killing who they're killing. They'll question orders that seem wrong. And when that happens, they'll need to know that asking questions doesn't automatically make you a traitor. That thinking for yourself doesn't mean betraying the Emperor. That there's a difference between loyalty and obedience. He placed a hand on Hesiod's shoulder, the gesture almost fatherly despite the violence those hands had committed. We can't redeem ourselves, but we can be an example. A warning and a possibility both. We can show them what happens when you become nothing but a weapon. And we can show them what it looks like to try to be something more. Even if it's hard, even if it hurts. Even if you fail. Hesiod nodded slowly, processing. Then a thought seemed to strike him. The custodian, Valores. He said the Emperor created us to kill, that none of us deserve redemption. Do you think that's true? Do you think the Emperor looks at us and sees only weapons? I don't know what the Emperor sees, Maylock admitted. I don't know if he sees anything anymore. Chained to that throne, burning souls like candles just to keep reality from collapsing. But I know what he created, and he didn't just create weapons. If he wanted weapons, he could have made servitors. Lobotomized warriors without thought or will. Perfect tools that would never question, never hesitate, never refuse. Instead, he made us. He made warriors who could think, who could choose, who could look at an order and decide if it was worth following. He paused, staring at his own reflection in the armored glass. Maybe that was his mistake. Maybe he should have made us simpler, more obedient, less capable of independent thought. But he didn't. And I think, somewhere in that decision, there's an answer. He made us capable of choosing because he wanted us to choose. Not blindly, not without thought, but genuinely. To look at the galaxy and decide what was worth fighting for. The two Minotaurs stood together in silence, watching the stars slowly wheel overhead. Out there, in that vast darkness, the Imperium ground on. Trillions of humans living and dying without ever knowing the secret wars fought in their name. The political games played with their lives. The compromises made with their futures. And protecting them, or claiming to protect them, stood the Space Marines, humanity's finest. The Emperor's angels. Weapons forged in gene labs and baptized in blood. But also men, flawed, capable of mistakes, capable of being used, and capable, just maybe, of being something more than what they were designed to be. Weeks later, the Minotaurs received their first mission from Guilliman directly. Not through the High Lords, not through intermediaries. A message sealed with the Primarch's own mark, transmitted on channels that hadn't been used in 10,000 years. The orders were simple. A forge world on the edge of the Cicatrix Maledictum was under siege by a warband of Chaos Space Marines. Traitors who'd once been loyalists, who'd made their own choices, and decided that the Imperium wasn't worth serving anymore. Defend the world. Save what could be saved. And try not to kill anyone who didn't deserve it. The last line wasn't protocol, it was personal, a reminder, a challenge, or maybe a prayer. Malak read the message 3 times before activating the fleet. As the labyrinth's engines roared to life, as the navigator began calculating their path through the warp, he thought about the brazen bulls one final time, those warriors who died for choosing mercy, who'd been erased from history because they'd valued conscience over obedience. They'd failed, they'd died. They'd been forgotten by everyone except the people who wanted to make sure no one ever followed their example. But they'd been right. Valores had said it. The Primarch had said it. And more importantly, Malak knew it in his bones, in the genetic memory that had survived multiple attempts to erase it, in the part of him that was still human underneath the armor and the augmentation and the centuries of conditioning. They'd been right, and that mattered. It mattered more than success or failure, more than life or death, more than anything except the fundamental question that every sentient being had to answer eventually. What am I willing to become? The Minotaurs translated into the warp bronze armor, gleaming one final time before reality swallowed them. They were heading toward another war, another battle, another opportunity to fail or succeed or simply survive. But this time, they were going as something more than executioners. They were going as warriors who could choose, who could question, who could look at an order and decide if it deserved to be followed. They were going as space marines. Real ones, the kind the Emperor might have actually wanted, if anyone had bothered to ask him what he was really trying to create all those millennia ago. In the end, perhaps that's what every empire needs. Not monsters, not weapons without conscience, not perfect soldiers who follow every command without thought. What every empire truly needs, desperately needs, is warriors brave enough to say no when no needs to be said, strong enough to question when questioning is dangerous, wise enough to understand the difference between loyalty and obedience. The Imperium stands on the edge of extinction, held together by faith and fear and violence. But somewhere in that darkness, bronze-armored warriors fly toward battles they chose to fight, following orders they decided were worth following, serving an empire they're trying to save not from its enemies, but from itself. The question that haunts the highest halls of power, the question that keeps chapter masters awake in the dead of night, the question that echoes through 10,000 years of blood and glory and terrible compromise, remains unanswered. When humanity desperately needs heroes, will it find them? Or will it find only the monsters it created? Perhaps the answer is simpler than anyone wants to admit. Perhaps monsters and heroes aren't different species. Perhaps they're the same warriors making different choices, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one refusal at a time. The Minotaurs were the High Lord's secret enforcers, the executioners who killed without question, the monsters who reminded every space marine that power was conditional, that independence was dangerous, that thinking for yourself could be fatal. But they were also the brazen bulls, reborn and remembering. They were warriors who chose death over dishonor. They were the example that needed to exist, even if it was painful, even if it was imperfect, even if it was nothing more than a warning written in bronze and blood. They were proof that choice matters, that conscience exists, that somewhere between the weapon and the wielder, the warrior gets to decide who they want to be. And in a galaxy of endless war, where hope dies a little more each day, that might be the only thing worth fighting for: the right to choose, the courage to refuse, the wisdom to know that loyalty without thought isn't loyalty at all. It's just another kind of slavery wearing prettier chains.